reality seems to be that less is more. It may be that what a plant-based diet does for our health, it becomes a easier way to implement dietary restriction without malnutrition. The only way we've ever extended an organism's life with diet alone is through dietary restriction without malnutrition, which is giving it just enough nutrition so that it can live, but not enough to push it into the reproductive mode. Moderation is the enemy of success for creating a new habit. You don't moderate yourself to a new habit. You got to be extreme. Go for it. Don't worry about protein, carbs, and fat. Don't use those things. Just vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. Soups, salads, sides, and sweets. That's our message.
That was Ray Cronise, and he is this week's guest on the Alter Your Health podcast. This is your source of information and inspiration to promote the holistic transformation of your health and the health of our planet. And I'm Dr. Benjamin Alter. I'm the host of this podcast and licensed naturopathic physician practicing holistic lifestyle medicine online, worldwide. Find out more at www.alter.health. So this week's episode is a special one because it is the longest episode ever recorded on the Alter Your Health podcast. But hey, that's just par for the course for our guest, Ray Cronise. I first learned about Ray and heard his wisdom shared on the Rich Roll podcast. Everything that he said and shared really did kind of resonate as true. And he is a scientist. He has studied this stuff in his body. And that's what this whole conversation is about. Cultivating a deeper understanding of what's going on underneath the hood of that vehicle of yours, that body of yours. What is your metabolism? What does that mean? What is that combustion engine happening inside of each one of your cells? What is taking place? And what are the fuels that are powering your engine of your metabolism? So these are some of the things that we talk about in this podcast. And this episode has a slant towards longevity, towards increasing health span, which is, by the way, the title of Ray's latest book that he is co-authoring with plant-based dietitian, prior Alter Your Health guest, Julieanna Hever. The Health Span Solution is going to be out in just a few weeks from the release of this episode, mid-December 2019. So get your hands on a copy and learn about how to increase your health span. And it's really, as Ray mentions, quite simple, but we can make things as complex as we'd like. And we get into some complex things in this conversation with Ray, but that's the nature of a scientist, right? To get granular, to get into the nitty-gritty so that we can better understand the whole. So if you don't know Ray Cronise, he shares a little bit about his journey, how he lost his weight, actually without any diet or exercise, but with just cold stress. And that story is actually highlighted in Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Body. We talk a little bit about that relationship with Tim Ferriss, who is, more of a paleo keto kind of guy, and how Ray is still able to be friends with him, even though he's a plant-based person. But the great thing about Ray, as you'll come to know, is he doesn't have an ounce of dogma or ideology inside of him. He's just a curious scientist, and he is experimenting in the laboratory of his own body, and I might add the body of many others, as well as he is coaching people in reducing dramatic amounts of weight with really just changing how we're swallowing. So, and by that I mean what we're swallowing and how often we're swallowing. So Ray has a passion for metabolism, also mild cold stress, dietary restriction, and nutrition research. He's an ex-NASA scientist and now is diving into understanding how the body works, how the metabolism works. His work has been featured in Wired magazine, TEDMed 2010, ABC Nightline, The Atlantic, The Daily Beast, and like I mentioned, The 4-Hour Body. And Ray helped Penn Jillette lose 100 pounds, detailed in Penn's book, Presto. Ray also co-authored Plant-Based Nutrition, The Idiot's Guide in 2018 with Julieanna Hever, the plant-based dietitian. And like I said, he's got a new book just around the corner, about to be released, The Health Span Solution. So Ray is a brilliant guy. We get into the weeds here a little bit, but hopefully we don't lose sight of the forest through the trees, and hopefully we're able to grab onto some pearls. And I might add that this episode is on YouTube, as all Alter Your Health podcast episodes are. And Ray guides us through a little metabolic presentation, guiding us to understand what the metabolism is, how fats and carbohydrates are specifically utilized in, proportionally to create energy in your mitochondria, some of the things that we get into. So if you're able to watch the YouTube presentation, that might help. Also, you might need to break this one into some bite-sized chunks. This is a longer episode, like I mentioned. Hopefully, you're able to digest it all. And I do think that Ray will be back at some point down the road to dive even deeper and to dive into so many of the other things that we didn't have a chance of talking about in this long episode today. Real quick, before we dive into this episode, I just want to remind you, if you are a new listener, feel free to subscribe. Also, leave a rating, a comment, a review, a like, whatever it is, wherever you're tuning in from. I really do appreciate that feedback. It really helps me learn and grow. So why don't we all take a breath, let it go, and enjoy this conversation with our guest, Ray Cronise. Well, Ray Cronise, thank you so much for making the time to be on the Alter Your Health podcast. So happy that you're here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, I have been acquainted with your work for some time now, read some papers and just reread some papers, which took me back to undergrad biochemistry and physiology. I was actually an exercise physiology major. So this stuff isn't all that foreign to me, even though I obviously launched into medicine, which it's like, for some reason, we forget about the basics in medical school. But in any case, I'm really excited to dive into some science. I trust that this will probably be one of the more scientific conversations that I have on the podcast. Usually it's a little bit less sciencey, but you're a scientist, so what can
That's great.
That's what we
well,
got to do.
And the thing about it is the irony of that is that both myself and Julieanna Hever, the plant-based dietitian, who is my partner in everything, we basically, even though both of us are extremely technical, our message is surprisingly simple. So we try to bring things up to a higher level. So, if you're going to watch this much and don't want to watch anything more, it's basically eat vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. I mean, it can be that. And don't eat so frequently. Don't stay in the fed state all day long. So, that's kind of the overview summary. And of course, we agree a lot on the food side, and there's a lot of debate out there, but the real question, I think, getting into the science side is, why does that work? And I think what we're going to see over the next decade is an infiltration of the last 80 years of longevity and health span research. And the surprising, sort of the spoiler of this, the surprising reality seems to be that less is more. It may be that what a plant-based diet does for our health is actually it becomes a easier way to implement dietary restriction without malnutrition. In other words, the only way we've ever extended an organism's life with diet alone, forget the other kinds of ways that we've done it, is through dietary restriction without malnutrition, which is giving it just enough nutrition so that it can live, but not enough to push it into the reproductive mode. And why that's so important to understand is, first, that the genes are conserved, or we see them consistently throughout all of biology. It's not like mice versus monkeys versus rats versus humans versus all the things that people might worry about. Oh, does that apply? The answer is every organism, all the way down to yeast, seem to have these same genes. And the second thing about this is that it's been consistent. The biomarkers and things have been consistent. So while we want to think of a plant-based diet as being very nutritious, and it very much is, its adequacy may not be what we need to look at today. What we might want to look at is the fact that it naturally restricts certain things. And why is that important? Because if you start supplementing or doing protein shakes and all these other things that were actually benefit of the plant-based diet, if you start adding all that back in, we see this with all the mock meats when someone is doing it for an ideological reason instead of a health reason. And those both can exist, and they may overlap, but they may not be the same solution. But as we go into this idea that we're overnourishing ourselves, staying in the fed state, getting these smoothies so that we can get lots of good nutrition, this idea of combating deficiency, as you well know from the medical perspective, is what we all tend to look at, that we're all deficient in something, that we need more. And it turns out the longevity and health span research doesn't work that way. We don't extend organisms' lives by giving them more, except where certain compounds that tend to activate one of the 3 or 4 longevity pathways. Other than that, they're not more vitamins, they're not more protein, they're not more carbohydrates, not more fats. And so Julieanna and I are trying to sort of scrub our message of that and bring it all back to food at the end. So even though we're going to do a little bit of technical stuff, I really think that if we actually bring the dialogue back to what's in the produce section of the grocery store and call food by what it is, and we have a mnemonic called the food triangle to do this, to serve as a guide. If we do that, I think health will kind of be automagic. I don't think, at least the things that we can delay now, you're not going to be immortal because you switch to eating carrots. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is significantly delaying the onset of age-related chronic disease.
Totally. So that's kind of the summary. I love that you kind of put it all out there, and now we're going to kind of understand things a little bit deeper. But before we do, I'd love to just kind of, hear a little bit about your story, how you came into this space as a scientist of metabolism, because I know you were a researcher for NASA for some time. So like, what was that journey like for you? And I know there was a personal connection with your health and weight. So just share a little bit about how you've come to focus in as you have.
Yeah. So short and sweet, I was sick and fat.
Yeah.
That's what it really comes down to. By the time I had reached, say 41 or 42, I was nearly 250 pounds. I had tried many diets, Body for Life and Sugar Busters and everything, and they work for a while. I was big into martial arts when I was younger, so I was really into physical fitness. I loved that stuff. I loved the gym, but the entrepreneurial job I had after I left NASA just left me taking clients out to dinners and traveling all the time and eating at restaurants. And I culminated with having I was passing out after meals because of what we believed to be at the time reactive hypoglycemia. And I don't know what it was, but I was definitely, my hemoglobin A1C was high. My blood glucose, fasting blood glucose was high, and I was having issues, digesting starches and sugars. And I just didn't want to be sick anymore. So I lost the weight first using mild cold stress. So if you Google me, you'll find a lot of stuff. And that got popularized by a guy by the name of Tim Ferriss that wrote a book called The 4-Hour Body. And he wrote a chapter about the cold stress. And so I actually used the fact that our body needs a lot of energy to generate internal heat. And I used that to actually lose my weight. But surprisingly, when I lost my weight, my diabetes got worse. So I was actually having worse situations. And a year after I lost the weight, I was at TED Med just as a participant. in Southern California. And I asked Dean Ornish, he and his wife Ann were there, and we were at a party together, and we were all standing there talking. And I asked him about, my symptoms. He asked me what I was eating, and really the only animal products were fish, eggs, and a little bit of yogurt, because I was doing the sort of yogurt and cottage cheese. So I had, fish, eggs, and dairy basically.
So was it
And
kind of at that point like a version of a paleo-ish diet, like a low carb, high protein?
yeah. So I wouldn't define it as, again, we'll talk later why we don't want to go to protein, carbs, and fat.
Yeah.
But to describe it, I was eating lots of plant material in my diet, and I was eating very frequently, 5 or 6 times a day, smaller meals. And I wasn't eating chicken at this point. I wasn't eating burgers. I mean, occasionally I might have one, but for the most part, I would have salmon, asparagus, your typical salmon on a cedar plank with, asparagus and lemon. Or I would have
super healthy,
super healthy, right?
Yeah.
Yogurt and yogurt and cottage cheese. That became sort of a diet staple of mine. You mix the two up, and I would eat that in the morning, have that. Or I would have, sushi occasionally. So maybe sushi. I mean, I really wasn't even eating that much fish. I mean, I was having it some, but it wasn't a lot. And then, every now and then, when my kids would come over, like on the weekends, we'd do some slow cooked scrambled eggs, but I wasn't having bacon with it, wasn't doing sausage with it. I wasn't even using lots of oils at that point either. I mean, not tons of it. So it was a pretty, what I would say, people would say it was a clean diet, but I was sick. So clearly contradictions don't exist. And I was willing to try anything. And so he simply asked me, would I be willing to give that up for about 45 days? And in fact, it was 10 years ago last week that he and I had that conversation. And so I said, sure, I'll try that. And then I came home about this time of the year. I started doing research. I got a bunch of, different books, Furman's, Bernard's, lots of different books, McDougall, the whole litany of the vegan diets. And I decided, hey, I'm going to do this for a year. So I started on November 23rd, 2009. And I said, I will not, and that's the week, by the way, before Thanksgiving. I did not start after Thanksgiving. So I feel like this is a sort of a little snippet on mine and Julieanna's philosophy. If you're going to make a change, just freaking make the change. Don't wait till the next thing, because you'll never get around to it.
You can always find a way to postpone your change. There's always something to postpone.
Yeah. So I started November 23rd, 2009. I went to Sam's. I still have my grocery list. I can show you exactly what it was. I bought 22 pounds of vegetables that day and fruits, and I just started eating. And I would say for the first 2 months, it was really bad. It sucked. I don't know why taking those 3 ingredients out of my diet made me feel like there was nothing to eat, but for some reason it did. And so, but the good news was right on cue, within a month and a half of me taking those last 3 things out of my diet and eating nothing but vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices, my hemoglobin A1C came down. My glucose stuff went away. I didn't have any problems anymore. And that really blew my mind. It really blew my mind. And so then when Tim's book came out in 2010, that was after my TED Med talk, which was the next year, I, for a short period of time, went back on that diet. He called it the slow carb gourmet, or slow carb, not gourmet, slow carb diet. So I added a few things back in, and within days, I had problems again. So that was like, okay, I've got this. Now, then, after that point, I had also met a guy by the name of David Sinclair, who right now is getting on all the podcasts, but 10 years ago, I knew who I didn't at that point, but after that point, he was big in the longevity, as a longevity researcher, but he wasn't outside of there. Lots of people haven't known about him until recently, but he's the guy behind resveratrol and, the supposedly the red wine, longevity thing, the supplement. But
Yeah.
he told me the molecule stress stuff that I was doing to lose weight had a lot more application in health span and longevity. And he encouraged me to dig deeper and said, if you want some help on this, I'd love to collaborate. So we met at TEDMed again 10 years ago last week. And along the way, I started collaborating with another guy who eventually went on from Vanderbilt to NIH, was a guy that's Andrew Bremer. He was the past program director of type 2 diabetes when he took over there, and now he's a pediatric endocrinologist. So he's a PhD MD, and David's a biologist, so he does genetics. So the three of us wrote the metabolic winter hypothesis in 2014. They both basically said, we'll support you. We'll throw our academic credentials behind what you're doing because we think what you're doing is right. So by that time,
you wrote it.
I wrote it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote it. And then, obviously they both contributed, in their sections, they contributed, in lots of it. And part of it is assembling a team of people that don't necessarily agree with you. This is the one thing that I think in science that we don't realize. And we see these, you see lots of journalist type, armchair scientists, and they go and they just, put a bunch of things together and then get up in an echo chamber with a bunch of people that agree with them. And then it's easy to convince yourself. It's easy when you have a solution and you want to go find evidence to support that, but that's just not how science works. Yeah. So it was really good because neither one of them none of us were vegan. We weren't vegetarian. It wasn't an ideology. We were trying to explain some really interesting facts. And that was that paper. And then in doing that, we wrote the food triangle, and we sort of gave some hints to where we were going with oxidative priority in that paper. If you look at the food triangle and if you look at the figure description, we put some things down there that sort of gave a lead into oxidative priority. But then I spent the next 2 years really researching that side. And by that time I had bought, I had a Cosmic Quark CPET, a $30,000 midlife crisis calorimeter. And so I was going from my kitchen to my lab, and spending 4 hours measuring everything through with a glucose monitor implant. And
so was this just inspired out of your own curiosity?
I'm sort of crazy that way. So I don't like go half in with something. I really need to dig in. So I really, the truth is that it was just a fun thing to talk about at a party. And I did so at a party in 2009 with Tim Ferriss. And then he's like, dude, I'm writing this book. If you can keep a secret, I want to write a chapter about you. And I said, sure, let's do this. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it. And then we were about to appear on ABC Nightline. He's like, where are you going to capture all these leads and these emails? I said, I don't know. He said, you don't have a website or anything? And no. So I threw one up and started blogging like 2 days in December. I just started blogging 2 days before it went up on Nightline. He's like, you got to do this. You can't. And so, but then
you should have read it. You should have read 4 Hour Work Week first.
I should have. Yeah, exactly. But I was just trying to solve the problem for me. I wasn't trying to market anything. I wasn't trying to.
And it's really refreshing to like someone who's just kind of curious, genuinely curious, no agenda.
And I really still don't have one. It's difficult for me to monetize the things that we're doing sometimes, just because I would do what I'm doing for free if I had an unlimited bank account. It's just interesting to me. And so, but when Tim's thing went out, what I wasn't prepared for were all the challenges. So that's when I got the dose of all the, the haters, In other words, a lot of people are challenging what you're saying, and I had never measured a metabolism by that point. So they were saying, well, how do you know cold burns calories? And, they'd show this study and that study, and I'd look at it. And so so by the next year, really by maybe it took me about a year and a half. Within a year and a half, I bought a calorimeter. And so that changed everything, because then as I started measuring things and measuring metabolism, I really a picture began to open up that was very different from what I believed to be true. So, it was at that point, and this all precedes obviously this first paper, the Metabolic Winter Hypothesis.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting is that so much of the overlap between dietary restriction that I talked about at first, meaning restricting down to, having just enough but not too much, and mild cold stress, that both of those elicit a similar reaction at the mitochondrial level, meaning these are the little power plants. I'll show you guys in a second, but these are little power plants of how our cells derive energy. And at that level, there are things that are activated in those little power plants that are designed to sort of conserve energy. These are the core of biogenesis, and this overlaps even with with the genetic side of it. When you hear about resveratrol and other things, too deep to go into on this conversation, but they are all related. And that's the part David was pointing out to me. So when I was measuring my diabetes coming and going and associating that with diet, it started to look completely different. And on top of that, I had a swim spa in my backyard, so I could take water temperature down to 45 degrees or take it up to 102 and measure metabolism when you're immersed in water. In fact, Wired magazine, if you Google out there, you'll find an article. Stephen Leckhart wrote an article. He came here for a week and we were measuring his metabolism, and in various situations, from doing kettlebell swings to treadmill to cold immersion. And it doesn't work the way everybody thinks it is. Yes, calories in and calories out matter. Don't let anybody tell you that they don't. They absolutely matter if you count all the calories. And the problem with counting calories is that waste heat is the number one place that you're disposing of calories. So maybe another way to look at this is that when you're driving your car, you get better gas mileage on the highway, not in the city. And if you ask a person, well, where did the extra energy, the extra miles per gallon go? Where did that energy efficiency go? Where did that gas efficiency go? Everybody will say start and stop, because that's what happens. They'll describe that as the difference between city driving and highway driving. And I'll say, yeah, that's true. Start and stop has something to do with it, but that's not where it went. So where did the energy go? Like, energy is something. When you plug something in, energy comes out, your utility meter runs, right?
Yeah.
Where did it go?
Right?
Huh?
Heat?
It makes your brake pads hot.
Heat, yeah.
That's where the extra gas mileage goes. It makes it's waste heat, and it makes your brake pads hot. And your muffler maybe gets a little hotter when you're accelerating, but it goes to waste heat. That's where it goes.
Yeah.
Because once you're moving.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I remember in a biochemistry class, my professor said, asked us, why do you get warm when you pull over the covers at night? Where does that heat come from? And it was it's not coming from the blanket.
Yeah.
It's coming from you,
Yeah. And so my weight loss was just simply the opposite of that, to not blanket as much, to not cover as much. It's fall right now, and I have a short sleeve shirt on. So, I tend not to layer as much. And it turns out those same genes seem to be conserved in biology, and mild cold stress and dietary restriction both tend to. It seems a simple explanation might be, but maybe not totally accurate, is that it preserves the organism in a time of no food and cold, metabolic winter, cool, dark, still, and scarce, for a later time when food is better and it's better to reproduce. So if you're not in reproduction mode, go, grow. Metabolic summer is warm, bright, active, and abundant. Lots of food, lots of nutrition, lots of energy, lots of activity, and you're very fecund then. You're very reproductive. But during those times when your offspring aren't going to survive, it may be that our bodies kick in these survival genes for a later time when evolution would be more benefited by reproduction. So that may be a simple explanation of why it happens. And now go ahead.
Just the metabolic winter paper is very comprehensive, coming at it from many different angles, from melatonin to calorie restriction and
Sleep.
All of the things kind of pointing us to this in the same direction. And, the big takeaway for me is wow, we are really living disconnected from natural rhythms and harmonies. And,
Absolutely. And we all know we have
you know,
circadian rhythms, right? We know
yeah,
that the light impacts us. What's to say that the seasons don't? I mean, think
yeah.
about it.
Oh,
Every organism in your backyard is in some way impacted by the seasons. Every
yeah.
insect, every animal, every plant, you know?
Yeah. And I heard you say a couple times in a couple different ways, something along the lines of like a squirrel doesn't train for a marathon or
No,
something.
exactly. It's crazy.
It's not, it's
Min-
like the weight management of natural animals in their natural habitat, eating their natural diet is just natural. They don't have to
yeah,
go out of their way to manage weight.
yeah, it's access, not excess. So in other words, we're focused on what to eat, but it's all based on the same lens of eating as much as we possibly can without gaining weight. And in nature, animals have a restriction, but it's just because access is difficult. Food isn't that abundant. And so what's the biological downside in a calorie scarce world? What's the evolutionary downside in a calorie scarce world? To have a big appetite? None. So if you're overweight right now, you're a super survivor. That's because those organisms that didn't eat in a calorie scarce world as much as they possibly could when food was available, they probably didn't jump into the gene pool with the same gusto as our real ancestors that actually ate as much as they possibly could because food was limited. And then as we have better engineering prowess as an agricultural prowess, as we learn to master our environment, temperature and food, agriculture, refrigeration, transportation, then what ends up happening is that winter never comes. And that's
Right.
the three last words of the paper. We don't have a time of scarcity. We don't have a time of mild cold stress. We've just, essentially engineered the seasons out of our lives. And I'm not talking about seasons in a more ethereal, new agey natural thing. This isn't what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is real biological feedback loops that we can hijack or use to our advantage to be ready to go. And so what Julieanna and I are writing about in Healthspan Solution, which is the book that comes out
Yeah.
in December, is if you think about life in a different way, if you think about you can eat almost anything and make it to puberty, make it to reproductive age, wide range of diets, you're going to make it to reach puberty. Then if you think of the next 15 to 20 years of reproductive prime, you can eat a wide range of foods and successfully have children. I mean, look at our world population. It does not have to be that nutritionally perfect. Not saying that, there isn't better health consequences, et cetera, but to actually just reproduce from an evolutionary gene passing on perspective. And then let's add the next 15 years onto that because our youngest offspring, we want to have them reach reproductive age. So 15 plus 15 plus 20 plus 15, somewhere around 45 or 50, evolution is done with you. If you want my argument why a Paleolithic diet is irrelevant, it's because it doesn't matter what we ate to reproduce and to make evolution successful. The real question is what can we eat or what should we eat, maybe is a better way to say it, to minimize those age-related chronic diseases that come in after evolution is done with us, after reproductive prime. And my belief is the sooner that you can get on to doing that, probably the longer your health span is going to be.
Yeah. And we are living in a world where, reproductivity is kind of plateauing. Like, less and less men are actually fertile. There's this, big, huge fertility issue. And I know there's a lot of potential reasons why that's happening, but it's like our human species is kind of like stressed and threatened.
At the other end of life, I
Yeah.
think that they are because access has never been better. And I think at some point, those negative, feedback loops. Certainly, I mean, we saw this on, the demonstration, which I think was took the show on Game Changers. If you watch that, was, the
Yeah.
guys in their erection, they don't realize that, hey, this erection is blood flow. And at the end of the day, when you start clogging up things, that's what, you got this aorta coming out, coming down and splitting, and things start to neck down, and that flow makes a difference. I mean, it's very positively associated with people who have heart attacks. Erectile dysfunction beforehand is high percentage. So, and Viagra, originally was a blood pressure. It was a hypertensive medicine, and then, all these guys got this side effect, and we're like, hey, let's market the side effect.
This will make us more money. Yeah.
Exactly. So this all relates to it, and I think, health span is, managing health span is about, we really want to live as full and as vital as we can to the end. I want to be, for me, because of my age, my big goal is, how can I extend my life? Because I don't want to be the last generation that dies early.
Yeah.
I think your generation has way more possibility of a radical lifespan extension. And
We'll see.
I'm right at the cusp, because I don't know if we're going to get there fast enough. I'm right at the cusp.
Well, what I hear and appreciate in terms of your kind of mission is that you're not really ideologically attached to things. It's kind of like you just want to figure things out and allow humans to choose. You're not force feeding humans and saying this is the right way to live and you got to do this. But it's like, let's figure stuff out so that we can choose with as much, knowledge and empowerment, and not just be blindly led.
Yeah. And part of our mission, Julieanna and I really push this, which is, until the new diet is equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable to your old diet, you don't have a choice. One or more of those is likely going to dominate your plate.
Yeah.
And when you combine that with the idea that all food is habit, if you like it, it's habit. It has nothing to do with something as you're designed to eat this or that, plant or animal. It doesn't matter. We eat what we can to get calorie and nutrition to reproduce, and then evolution's done with us.
Yeah.
Those habits, whether they're cultural habits or ideologically driven or, whatever driven, those habits need to be changed so that you have a choice. And what you're saying right now is so important. You cannot make someone do anything. I personally don't like the idea of, I personally want people to fall in love with our ideas, to use sort of the compassion message. I don't want to force feed somebody. I don't think you can force feed change. I can't make someone stop smoking. I can't make
not
someone
sustainable
do anything.
Change.
It's not. Yeah. So if you want someone to fall in love with your ideas, I don't know how you do that with guilt and shame. And so, one of the downsides of for whatever good purposes that for example, someone who's ideological vegan, and they're really pushing hard saying, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. Well, you're leading with guilt and shame. You should feel horrible what you're doing with those animals. You should feel horrible. Well, they haven't, you probably didn't get there overnight, and they may not be where you are on the journey. And then leading with guilt and shame. I mean, religions do it too. So there's so much guilt and shame. I don't think that that's necessarily the outward intention. But when it comes to diet, I'm really sensitive to the fact that I want the right answer. I'm not driven by the environment or politics or ideology or any of those things. I just want, my little knot hole is, I want to understand the best I can, and I want to selfishly feel good. And I feel like what we're doing now, when I look at, for example, people like Penn Jillette, people like Kevin Smith, and not just to name drop, but these are clients that have influenced thousands of people to give this a try.
Totally.
I think that is a place where you can really move people. And I think and by the way, I can attack the ideology on the other side too. The people that are driven and think somehow meat is, they're only, every answer comes back to a steak.
Yeah.
They're fooling themselves, because what they're doing, by the way, if you want to know how I believe this story is going to end, and we come back in 10 years, here's you're going to see. I think what you're going to see is these people feel really great during reproductive prime. Then watch what the fallout's going to be in 20 or 30 years when they're my age. They're not going to age the same way, because my age profile, David's age profile, they changed. And you probably don't have to be all the way vegan to do it. I just don't know what the lower limit is, and why I know that I don't need to do that. If you properly supplement, I really just don't need to have that last little bit. So, I'm the kind of person that I'm not going to complain if there's a little bit of shrimp paste when I'm in a temple in China eating a meal there, that's a Buddhist meal, but yeah, there's a little bit of shrimp paste in there. I'm not going to push it back. I'm going to accept that person's culture where they are. And I'm going to say this is not really my move, but even if it were my goal, this is not changing the overall thing that people are ideologically vegan for. So at the same time, I'm not the one contributing to the things that those people complain about, the factory farming and all this stuff. And I see why a person might have that viewpoint. It just doesn't motivate me. Mm-hmm. And I think because of that, I always keep my eyes open to what these other diets say. And I still, even with that, don't see that the other things are necessary. I don't see that.
Well, I've got a lot of questions bubbling up, of course. And the first one, going back a little ways to your appearance and connection with Tim Ferriss in his book and the cold stress thing, and losing weight predominantly by just exposing yourself to cold and showing how that's possible. I'm curious, like the light bulb and the connection with diet came after that. But is that something that you ever approached Tim about? Because he obviously is kind of keto meathead.
We were texting this morning. He's on his way out of the country. We were texting this morning. We stay in contact. He in fact, just interviewed Penn Jillette. That should be coming up on his. If he came to me and said, "Hey, Ray, how should I eat?"
Yeah,
I would say, not like you do. Not completely. I think some of the things he has are wrong. But I do think he's seeing positive benefits now. And I think that in time, there are some things that he might change and they would make it optimal. Let's face it, Ansel Keys wasn't a vegetarian. He had liver and onions in his book. Okay. So my guess is where that line is, best guess 5 or 10%. I don't know. So if he came to me and asked me, "Hey, Ray, how would I successfully implement a whole food plant-based diet?" I'd go, but I really don't care what he eats. I don't care what anybody eats.
Right. I definitely hear you on that one, but like, I'm just because he is kind of ideologically different. And I was just curious if that ever came up, post.
No, I mean, of course we talk about food and stuff, and he's always interested in what I'm doing next. So like, I have a diabetes paper and that Julieanna and I have been working on, and when it comes out, it's going to shake some trees. I'm sure he's going to really be puzzled because it's going to conflict with some of his worldviews.
Yeah,
it really will. And I think that's what's going to really be fun about that is when it does. I suspect he's the kind of guy who's going to say, okay, I really want to know more about this. Because we're very much cut from the same cloth when it comes to that. He's obviously exceedingly
also
bright.
Open-minded. Yeah.
Yeah, he's absolutely open-minded. He absolutely tries different things. I mean, when we were doing the fasting stuff in the very beginning, even you go back to my second or third long-term fast with Rhonda Patrick, the videos are out there. Tim had been to True North before I actually went for my first long-term one. And we talked a lot about that. He did, I think, a 7-day. And my first one I did was 14, but it was 14 days after I had already done a month of sustained weight loss. So I was doing sustained weight loss and then 14 days of fast is the very end. And that'll come out in another book called Our Broken Plate, which I am unbelievably late in delivering my Kickstarter. Everybody gives me trouble, but unfortunately, it's way harder to do it without a publishing team and without a group behind you with editors, et cetera, when you're funding it all yourself. But I am finishing, and it has a lot of the stuff in there. Unfortunately, things that I was way ahead of, way out in front of 4 years ago are now all bubbling to the surface, and the fasting stuff is part of it. But what I was going to say is, he's done a lot of work on that. I think if I were going to say where I believe most people are going astray in their research, is just the causal arrows are in the wrong direction.
Could
So
you
let me give you an
expand a little
example.
bit? Yeah.
So
What
I'll
you
give you an
mean there?
example. So when we look at all these studies, I think everyone will agree that obesity is associated with lots of different chronic diseases. And we would talk about, as a risk factor, when we look at risk factors and use that model for health rather than primordial prevention, which means go back and don't be exposed over the distance. My guess is obesity is just a result of some of the same dietary issues that cause the other issues. And while it may be slightly maladaptive and make it slightly worse, for example, diabetes, there's no doubt that obesity is associated with type 2 diabetes, without a doubt. And when they read our paper, it's really going to blow their mind because we're going to say something radically different, but to tease it a bit more. But it turns out that if I start a person on a diet way before they lose the weight, their diabetes is gone.
Right.
So it can't be causal.
What I hear you saying is that from baseline, disease and obesity are part of the same symptom.
Yeah,
obesity
and that's
just
the question
symptom.
And that's a great way to put it. So it says, okay, what are these symptoms? So let's just hang one nail out there: chronic overnutrition. So we're going to start from now. Forget all of what you know about biology. Forget all about the arguments you've heard online. And you start from the idea that the one dietary intervention that's worked from yeast to primates is dietary restriction without malnutrition. So the chronically fed state, from the time you wake up in the morning until 3 or 4 hours after you go to bed because you had a late night snack, the chronically fed state year round, along with overnutrition, and that's just excessive nutrition. One of those states, if that nutrition is in a certain form, makes you aggregate calories and aggregate weight. But still another one, thin people get cancer. Thin people have heart attacks. Thin people get diabetes, right? So that's just one of those little off ramps. And yes, since most people overeat and end up back to the survival gene that we were talking about, I'd say you were a super survival. If you eat a lot and you aggregate body fat, that's kind of a good thing in a world of scarcity. That happens to be a really common symptom with everything. And it's just an easy game to play. But it's not that the obesity necessarily is causing the heart attack, or the obesity is causing the diabetes, or the obesity is causing the cancer. It's just that it's one of those parallel tracks. And so like that, I think we're going to find the same thing right now. Keto diet's all the rage. I think they're going to find that ketosis is a result of, it's not a causal. I'm not saying that ketones don't interact with, like, for example, the sirtuin genes, which is one of the 4 main longevity pathways. They absolutely do. But I don't think that is the significance. I think the significance is going to be dietary restriction without malnutrition. And so, that becomes in Tim's research and other people's research like that. I think where they're doing really positive things is they're identifying some of these linkages. I just think the arrows are in the other direction. And I believe that probably a whole food plant-based diet is the easiest way to have high volume, decadent, fun, habituated fun, flavor, and enjoyment, and still be in the realm of dietary restriction without malnutrition.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it, because you can kind of follow the laws, follow the rules as you've laid out on many different types of quote unquote diets. But when it looks paleo, for example, it feels to me, I've never been on a paleo diet, but it feels and looks really restrictive to accomplish the same metabolic.
I think it's pretty easy. I mean, if you were eating like you're eating right now and just every now and then had some sushi, or every now and then had a chicken breast or something like that, see, this is one of the things and I now see this now because I deal with so many people in the vegan community. I see this now from 2 very different vantage points, because I don't have an ideological objection. It's not what drives me. but I don't eat animals. So it's really kind of a fun place to be. I can sort of just sit back and, because if you want to complain about me not eating animals for the wrong reasons, knock yourself out. It's not going to change my mind,
No,
right?
I'm not too much of an ideologue either.
No, but I'm not
so.
saying you, but I'm just saying if a person
Yeah.
really wants to do
Yeah.
that, believe me, they do it at conferences. I've been shamed or attempt to be shamed on more than one occasion that I was vegan for the wrong reasons, or that I was vegan at all, so anyway, it doesn't affect me because I just smile, say whatever you want. I'm fine. Whatever you're eating, whatever anybody else is eating, I'm completely okay with it. Just, I don't want to be involved. If you ask me what you should eat, then I'll be very strongly opinionated, right? So, which is what we're doing here. So I think what this comes down to is, a paleo diet it's ill-defined. It really doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, you can Google it's such a huge joke, but I started the whole time when the paleo was at its crescent, and Tim had me out there basically because of his book. Everybody was going to my blog and I was having huge traffic. And just for fun, I did the potato thing with rice. And now the potato thing is a thing. People actually believe it's a thing because people have been so unsuccessful. At the end of the day, you can't eat much food and you'll lose weight. It doesn't matter. I could do it on cheesecake. It does not matter. You can restrict your diet anyway. But what was so amazing is I had all of these people that were hardcore carb insulin, the carb insulin, theory of
everything of life.
Everything, right?
I mean, they hang everything on.
And I said, okay, if that's true, then show me how you're going to gain weight eating potatoes or rice. Go ahead, and you go back to my blog in 2011, you'll see, or 2012, whenever it was, you'll see that I blogged. It's on the microbiome one. You'll see that I challenged them. And they all started coming back. Oh my God, I'm losing weight. One of them even went off and wrote a book. He went over and planted the idea in Mark Sisson's Daily Apple, So there's this whole thing of voting. Can we call Ray paleo? Because he eats a vegan diet. I mean, it was so silly. And since Penn Jillette had this really great cups and balls trick, and the classic way he would do the cups and balls, but they would do it because, they like to give some things away. They would do it with clear cups. And so the end of the thing, he used to end the show when they would end the trick, he would end it and he'd say, it's a goddamn potato. That would be the last thing that they load in there. So they're doing all this juggling with aluminum foil and they do all this thing. At the very end, it's a potato, a goddamn potato, and I could just hear Penn saying it's a goddamn potato. If you go read the book Presto, he tells the story better than I do. But it was so funny to make a bunch of people who were anti-carb people, especially me being, hey, protein, carbs, and fat aren't food groups. It was so funny to use a potato and have everybody eating potatoes and having results. And it's like, okay, guys, this should tell you it has nothing to do with carbs. It's not what it is. There's something much more complex. Your little compression algorithm, you're compressing some things, I'm compressing some things. We're talking to each other. Both of us threw away good data. We're talking past. It has nothing to do with protein, carbs, and fat. This is just a confusion. And that's where oxidative priority eventually comes out. That's what that paper explains, why we gain weight. It's not a paper about how to lose. It's a paper on why we gain.
Yeah.
And it actually makes perfect biological sense.
Well, maybe it's a great opportunity to kind of launch into metabolism.
Okay.
That word that is used, it probably drives you nuts more so than it drives me nuts. Like, so maybe just starting with metabolism, like defining that, and understanding that as well as we can.
Right.
And I know you've got a little.
I'll screen share, and I can show a picture of this probably easier than I can say. So.
Yeah. So
you're
going to lead us through.
Yeah.
You're going to read us through this.
So basically this was, the last 10 years of my life, the idea of everything, using your children as lab rats. You can see a picture here of Steven when he's submersed, he looks like a sex slave or something underneath some bondage thing. But anyway, he's breathing a tube that's measuring the oxygen and carbon dioxide that's producing. Here he is running, doing it, or we have people doing kettle springs. There's Penn. he was doing his exercises and measuring it. The idea is when you combine this with DEXA scans and blood plasma, blood tests and glucose monitor implants, what happens is this really complex idea of how the body really works comes out. And at the end of the day, if we think about an engine, any engine, this is the space shuttle main engine firing, but it needs a fuel and an oxidizer. That's what your body needs. And obviously the fuel is food for us, and the oxygen, we all know what the oxygen is for oxidizer. And in this case, the space shuttle main engine, when it was firing, what was coming out of the end where that fire is a lot of heat, but water, because H2O, you're forming water. Most people don't realize the exhaust, not of the 2 boosters that used to be on the side of the space shuttle, but the 3 that were at the middle, that was just water spraying out the back. And it's crazy to think that making water can create that much energy, but this absolutely is the case. And in our body, what happens here is that, I don't know if is this a thing in the way? I can't tell if it's in the way. If
no, we're good. Yeah.
So
good.
So you got this mitochondrial, these little power plants in our body, the mitochondrial, and they use fuel, fats, and carbohydrates. They also use proteins, but proteins just basically get converted really to carbohydrates at some step, or some of them go into other things. But for the main part, just let's think of fats and carbohydrates as the fuel. The oxidizer comes in and they produce carbon dioxide, water, and heat. And this is happening in every one of your cells. I mean, there are many mitochondria in your cells. And so, but each one of these is an individual power plant. And what's so neat about this particular thing, and now I'm going to put a little chemistry in here, so it might get a little bit more difficult, but if we know how much oxygen we're breathing, and this is what these masks measure, if we know how much oxygen we're using, and we also know how much carbon dioxide that we're producing, you can exactly backtrack this and figure out what the fuel was. And so this is really technical. Don't worry about it if you've not had high school or any chemistry. But basically C6H12O6, that's sugar. And oxygen is the O2. And so it turns out that when you balance the equation, for every 6 oxygens you use, this is the only thing you need to know, for every 6 oxygens you use, you have 6 carbon dioxides produced. And so when you take a ratio of those 2 numbers, 6 over 6 is 1, you see at the very top here, and CHO refers to carbohydrate. That's how we talk about it in science. If that measurement is 1, you're burning glucose. And if that measurement is 0.7, you're burning fat. So it's just because of this chemistry. And why is that so important? It's so important because after the fact, we can figure out real time, breath by breath, what fuel you're using. And so it turns out that if you're burning, half and half, that ratio would show up, 0.85. So why does that end up being important? Well, it turns out that for all of these fuels, and I don't know if I have a pointer, but for all of these fuels on the left side here, don't worry about all the crazy numbers. Don't worry about the formulas. I solved the equations for every single thing that you could possibly metabolize and put it in here. What you find is that in this last column, the RQ, the respiratory quotient, when you're burning ethanol, when you're burning glucose or fructose, when you're doing lactose, beta hydroxybutyrate or acetoacetic acid, which are the ketones everybody's talking about. If you're looking at all the other fatty acids from various chain lengths, or even amino acids and proteins, it turns out that each one of these RQs can be actually calculated. And this is hard coded into the chemistry. So it's not wrong. This is like 1 + 1 = 2. So why is that then important? Well, what's really ends up doing is that by taking this mask, for example, and wearing this portable 30,000, this is another version, but a portable 30,000, I climbed 73 floors. Took 20 minutes, 720 feet. That's the downtown Weston. And I snuck into the basement, waited, and got my resting metabolism. And the question then becomes is, how many Oreo cookies does it take to get to the top of the Weston? Now, that's a lot of exercise. That's a lot of activity. But it starts to demonstrate why we have such a hard time losing weight, why we gain weight. And it starts to explain a little bit of why this inextricably intertwined diet and exercise may not be the best way to think about our health or food? And the answer is 3 1/8 Oreo cookies. That's it. 3 1/8 Oreo cookies. That's what it takes to get to the top. Nobody guesses their diet. So when I gained my 50 pounds over 20 years, that's an extra 168 calories a week. Nobody guesses their diet to that level. And so it's far more complicated. And this is why calorie counting doesn't count in its traditional sense, because they're not all processed the same. And what's really interesting when we look at this and say, what do you mean you burned all that energy? How come you didn't burn more? Well, it turns out that this line right here, if you look at the time, if you think time is on the bottom, so we're just going, say 1 second at a time or 1 minute at a time or 1 hour at a time. And as time goes on, what we have on the left-hand side on the vertical axis is how many calories consumed. So if you're just sitting perfectly still, you can imagine your body is slowly ramping up that dotted line, no exercise, and you're burning more calories. And depends on how many hours I measure you, that's how many calories will click up. And I can sit in my lab for 4 hours, 6 hours. I've measured as long as 20 hours, and that line just slowly goes up, right? Now, when you start to exercise, you're moving a lot more. And you're moving a lot more, so that line gets a lot steeper because you're burning more calories in the same unit time. And if I'm losing you at this point, don't worry about it, because I'm going to bring it back and say none of this matters. But for those geeky ones that want to know why, this is what happens. And then after you exercise, that line goes back. So if you look on the right-hand side, when you see that number on the treadmill, it's up that big number. The treadmill calories is that number, is the top number there, right? But the problem is, you would have burned the life calories whether you got on the treadmill or not. So only the difference is what actually counts, because your body had to stay alive anyway. And so what does this look like? Well, when we start taking that other thing, which is the respiratory quotient, we start measuring how much fat was I burning before I started? How much fat am I burning while I'm starting? How much fat when I'm burning afterwards? So in other words, it's not a simple calculation of just calories in and calories out. It's which energy storehouse are you taking them from? And so this is what a real experiment looks like. This is really someone doing this. So you can see during the warm-up down here, his respiratory quotient before he started exercise, you see this little 1, he was 0.80 before he started. So if you go over here on this chart, and I can't see from where that is, can I move around on my side?
This is what takes me back to my exercise physiology lab. I remember getting strapped on, right, and figuring this stuff out. And,
exactly.
The aerobic capacity and where you start burning carbohydrates over fat, and that whole respiratory exchange ratio, right?
Right, exactly. And so right here, he's burning around 66% fat or whatever on the lower side. Then he starts exercise, and it goes up to 0.91. And now he's burning 70% glucose and only 30% fat. And then after he gets off the treadmill and there's a little recovery, you can see the slope changes. So during this whole activity, he would have burned 55 calories had he not jumped on, but he did get on and he exercised for 20 something minutes, and he burned 196 calories, right? But of those calories, not very many of them were fat calories. And so what this comes down to is this. If we look at this, and what we're looking at is, a person up at the top is a person who has run for 5 miles an hour. So run for an hour versus sitting for an hour. One of them burned 75 calories. The other one burned 500 calories. It's just basically about 100 calories a mile, right? You had that rule of thumb in your exercise physiology class?
Sure. I guess it depends on your stride and all these things.
Right.
But yeah.
So, but it's about 100 calories a mile.
Yeah.
And so then we look on the left, and on the right hand, the actual part of that is fat. There was 37 calories burned when they were just sitting there, and 64. So there's definitely a boost. And the difference is about a half teaspoon of olive oil. Now, look, think about it. That's nothing compared to diet, right? So it's like, okay, that's not very much, and that's running for an hour. But here's the really crazy part. If that same person had been dieting for a couple of weeks, their resting respiratory quotient will be leaning on fat even more. And so what that means, the same 75, the same 500, but now while they're sitting there, their respiratory quotient has dropped. They burn 55 calories of fat
So
calories.
what do you mean by dieting? What does that mean?
They just restricted their intake for
just calorie restriction.
Just calorie restriction. So they're just restricting intake long enough for their body to go into survival mode and say, hey, I need to start conserving. And it doesn't happen in a day or two. It happens over days. Okay. So this is what's going on. Now the difference between running 5 miles and just sitting there is only a quarter teaspoon of olive oil. And that's not very much. That's not very much. So when we look at this, it starts making a difference. And here is real life. If everybody knows Dr. Michael Clapper, he supervised me on all my fasts. I had a calorimeter I was measuring every day. I took Dr. Michael Clapper, resting metabolism rate, and I want to show you how close the predictions are to where we are. And I measured his metabolism. He was fasted. He hadn't exercised. He came in, he sat down. We measured his metabolism first thing in the morning. And what did we find? Other than it's right under the screen. Can you move that screen a little bit so I can see it?
I'm not sure if I can.
Anyway, so what we find is, can you read those two numbers? Because I can't read what is
the rest.
The RMA.
Yeah.
RMR.
RMR is 1893 at rest, and what's pred?
That's predicted. So that's predicted versus
17th. Okay.
So it's exactly what it was predicted. Look how close they are to what the models. This is the Harris-Benedict equation from 1919, and they're that close. And what he's basically, you can see, he's burning 0.85, the same number I gave you guys earlier. 49. He's burning exactly half carbohydrate and fat. So here's a guy who is 6 foot something, and he's exactly on the equations. And what you find is, measuring hundreds and hundreds of people, they're all that way. They're basically burning that. Now, go to the next example. Here's Julieanna Hever, the plant-based dietitian. When we first met, we had her lose 12 pounds over 18 days. And so this is right after that occurred. And she's lost weight. And now, but she hadn't come off her diet yet. Now look at hers. Again, her resting metabolism rate versus predicted, even though she had been restricting for 18 days, even though she had lost 12 pounds, her metabolism wasn't crashed. It was exactly what it is predicted for her weight. But look at the difference. She's been on a diet now for a couple of weeks. Look at her respiratory quotient, 0.77. Just like the 0.8 I told you. And I've done this hundreds of times. So now what this means is she's now burning around 77% of her resting metabolism is coming from fat stores. Guys, this makes sense.
Because she's depleted her glycogen and she doesn't have carbohydrates.
It's not about restricting glycogen. It has nothing to do with that. That's the old way to look at it.
Then correct
She was
me.
eating nothing but starches and fruits. But she wasn't eating enough calories.
Calorie restricted.
She was calorie restricted, so she didn't have enough energy. So a better way to think about this is think about your checking account, right? We don't write our checks based on our daily deposits. We'd write our checks based on the account balance. And here's the big clue, guys. Fat is our energy storage organ. We don't use muscles and brains and organs when we have plenty of fat to use. Our body is smarter than that. We aren't, but our body is. And our body makes up those calories from fat calories. We don't use lean tissue to do this. We just don't. In times of restriction, our body starts leaning on fat more and more. And here's exactly the case. Her metabolism didn't crash. Sorry if your doctor said you have a slow metabolism, because of your age. This is just not right. It's food, unfortunately. That's what it is. And when we lose weight, our metabolism scales with our mass. And so this is what you see. And this is not just once. I've got every nutrition and metabolism historically significant nutrition and metabolism book going back to 1740, from 1740 to 1930. all of Lavoisier's work, all of Atwater's work, all of Liebig's work, all of Chinden's work, everybody's. And I'm telling you, those guys got this right. This is correct. This is how your body works. And the problem is we eat too much. End of story. That's just what it is. And why do we eat too much? There's lots of different reasons, but what I can say is a whole food plant-based diet is probably the best way to not be overnourished with eating a large volume of food. And so bringing that into the oxidative priority, actually, I should ask you, is there any other thing about metabolism I should clear up?
Well, I mean, certainly my own questions bubble up. One thing that I have witnessed kind of personally to some extent and heard a lot is that people restrict calories. They eat 1,200 calories a day for months and can't lose weight.
That's right.
And then they change their diet. They start eating different foods. They start eating a starchier diet, maybe a lower fat, whole food, plant-based diet, and they eat 2,000, 2,500, maybe even 3,000 calories a day. And then all of a sudden weight is started to, they start losing weight. So could you kind of explain that phenomenon?
Yeah, it's easy to explain.
Great.
Well, here's the first is that, so I got one more term to get in there, de novo lipogenesis. And essentially, our body is really poor. De novo means from new. Lipo is fat. Genesis is to create. So de novo lipogenesis is the process by where your body synthesizes fat. And it turns out our body's really bad at synthesizing fat. We do it some, but we don't do it a lot. And so in all the studies that we've done, whether they're radioactive tracers, complete calorimetry studies, balanced food equation, food studies, all metabolic ward where we know people aren't cheating, where they're completely controlled and they're being completely measured. What we find is at best 2 to 4% of the starchy foods that you're eating are being converted to fat. So that's step one. Step two is that most of the diet you just described is very filling. And so while they may be eating more, this idea that you made the assumptions that they're eating the same calories or they're eating more calories. Well, they may not be. They may not be because, again, those numbers are average numbers and they're based on average absorption and they're based on direct calorimetry measurements that were done 100 years ago. And the Atwater factors or the Rubner factors or even the modified Atwater factors are good, but they're not perfect. So if you're counting calories, probably the number's wrong. Probably. Okay. And so, in fact, how we calculate calories in food, remember I showed that first slide of metabolism, we're burning the fuel. Yeah. Well, that's what we literally do. We take a small sample of that food and we dehydrate it to get the water out and we put it in what's called a bomb calorimeter. And I had to do this for phenolic nozzle parts when I was at NASA, one of my first jobs when I was still a student. And I had to do bomb calorimetry every day for an entire semester. And there's nothing more boring than sitting there doing these samples over and over. So I can literally say I've done thousands and thousands of these measurements, I did do it with food because at some point you just want to do this stuff just to say you did it. You start putting all kinds of strange things in there just because. But essentially what you do is you take this small cube, you know exactly how much it weighs. You put it in this thing, you charge it with oxygen and you ignite it. And you wait for the heat to heat up the water bath and you measure how far the temperature went up. And that's a direct measures of calories. But because calories is how much energy it takes for, a gram of a gram of water to be raised 1 degree Celsius, or a kilogram for a kilocalorie, right, which is a dietary calorie is a kilocalorie. But the point here is we can measure that. But then of that, the question is, what are all of the metabolic efficiencies of how our body actually do it? So what's absorbed?
I just read the paper and was reminded by all the energy that goes into the metabolic processes.
Yeah. And it's not just the metabolic process. It is everything. And each one of these metabolic processes, whether you're wiggling or swallowing or whatever you're doing and what
or
the food
secreting
is,
digestive enzymes,
all
or
of these all of these things add up to what your overall respiratory quotient is. And so what may be happening in some of these cases is some of these diets may, like for example, if you go on a high fat diet and you eliminate all carbohydrates, why does it work? Well, the reason it works is because during your meal, after your meal, before your meal, you're basically eating, you're basically burning fat because you don't have the glycogen stores. That's where you started to go for that one thing, that you don't have to burn through your glycogen stores to burn fat, but that is a way that also works, right? If you don't have glucose in your body, or you don't have huge stores of glucose, your body's not going to use it as fuel. And well, but then why can they swallow all this extra calories and fat and they still lose weight? Well, the reason why is because they can't absorb all that fat. You need bile to absorb fat. And one of the things we know, even with vegans, a vegan actually has less bile production than an omnivore because of the fat load is a lot lower, and we see their bile production goes down. If you don't have bile to emulsify and carry the lipids to the brush border so they can be absorbed, you're not going to get it in. And if you want to do this, the crazy, stupid thing is this gallbladder cleanse. People do this gallbladder cleanse. They drink, olive oil with lemon juice, and they see green globs come out, and they're convinced these are gallstones. And really what they're making is bile soap, because the saponification reaction happens, and they do it with bile. So the bile makes those clumps that everybody's seeing, and what's coming out of your bottom in the toilet is little clumps of olive oil soap. That's what it really is. Right. But here's the point. If you drink a cup of olive oil, you cannot absorb it. Most of it will come out the other end. So these people that are eating a high fat diet, a lot of that energy is ending up in the toilet. Whereas when we're eating a high starchy diet with fruit, the way we're doing it, on the other hand, glucose is very well absorbed. If all those calories go in, they come in and they get stored as glycogen. But when you exceed your glycogen storage capacity, and I'm not saying not by 500%. I'm saying in a normal amount, when you just don't need all of that glycogen, what your body does is convert it to waste heat. This is pasta sweats, big pasta meal later, and you get all hot. Or another thing where I think most people can relate is alcohol. Alcohol isn't converted to fat. And I think a lot of people know, when you were younger, or maybe if you still drink, you go to bed, and suddenly you're sweating like crazy, back to your professor's example with the blanket, because your body has shifted to that alcohol as a priority to get rid of it, because you got to metabolize it, can't urinate it, can't defecate it, can't sweat it out. You have to metabolize it. So it becomes the highest priority. And what happens, your body ramps up your RMR while you're laying there in bed, shifts over to the alcohol, and now you're perturbating your sleep problem, because your body's trying to drop in temperature to fall asleep, bringing metabolic winter back in it. And you're now creating all this sweat. And think about, even when someone gets drunk, they get really active. They get, they want to move a lot. You sweat a lot. This is your body trying to get rid of all that stuff it can't absorb. Well, carbohydrates, starches, and sugars happen in the same way. And the same thing with amino acids. I could say the same thing about meat sweats. Go out, eat a bunch of ribs, ton of meat, and then later, what are you doing? Your body is basically sweating like crazy. And why is it sweating like crazy? Because all those amino acids can't be stored, so they're being converted to waste heat. And what's really amazing is if you look at the metabolic pathways of amino acids and sugars, they share the same acetyl-CoA, they say the pyruvate, they all go down straight through there. Nobody suggests that excess protein makes you fat. Never heard anybody ever say that. And yet sugars are digested in exactly the same way. But the difference here is that the totality of it, when your body in the presence of those extra fat carbohydrate calories, in the presence of the extra amino acid calories, in the presence of the extra alcohol calories, all dietary fat is stored. So the only two options you have is eat only fat and have the most of it go out into the toilet, and the little bit you absorb and your metabolism is prioritizing it all the time. That works. Or eat really high starch and avoid the fats, and then all of it goes out as waste heat instead of into the toilet, and you're not aggregating the extra fat, so you're having a deficit because it's high volume food where you're eating a lot but not having as many calories as you thought you had. So it's very satisfying in terms of that evolutionary survival trait of eat, eat, eat. Mm-hmm. And both of them work. Both of them work. In fact, here's the picture. Let's put this up while we're doing this.
Bring us back to the triangle.
Yeah, so this is exactly that diagram right here. So it's good. All right, here we go. So this is what you see on the left-hand side where you see when you see a Paleolithic diet, they're eating. So real quick, the food triangle at the top, at the apex, leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables. These are like broccoli, cauliflower, bok choy. Stems like asparagus and celery. Bulbs like onions, garlic, etc., and mushrooms. All of these are fiber, phytonutrients, lots of good nutrition, but not very many calories. So down one descending side, we have animal products, and animals source most of their energy when we look at animal products. It's not always the case, but most of it comes from fat. And then down the other side, we have plant-based foods, which are mostly sourced from starchy foods and glucose. Now, an exception, of course, is nuts and seeds, which are higher in fat. But for the most part, on one side, you're doing starchy sugars, and on the other side, you're doing more fatty foods, okay? We're not worried about protein. We're not thinking about foods in that way. We're just thinking this is how we segregate. Animals and plants segregate nutrition in different ways. It may be because they're higher up the food chain, but they segregate lots of other things in addition to just the energy component. But if you look at the energy component on the left-hand side here, what you see is a paleo diet basically is a lower energy diet because it's cut out all those extra energy on the right-hand side. And so you lose weight because it's a lower diet. A Western diet is what we would call bottom feeding. Now let's think of every recipe you ever knew. Burgers and fries, steak and potatoes, pasta and meat sauce, curry and rice, cheese and potatoes. Wow, isn't it amazing that in a calorie economic and calorie scarce world that all of our recipes are bottom feeding? And what's the idea around bottom feeding? Well, your body eats that food now. The glucose calories can be used instantly, and the fat ones are stored till later. But in our modern world, later never comes. This is the thesis of metabolic winter hypothesis. So then we go over on the vegan side and look at the plant-based diet side. We've just dropped all those fat calories. So those extra carbohydrate calories are burned off as waste heat. You can go a little bit lower calorie on this level only because you can eat a lot more of the fibrous foods. But remember, I hear a lot of times, well, nobody wants to just go on an all meat diet, although that's changed recently. But the point here is that there's nothing preventing someone on a high meat diet from eating top triangle foods. They could eat lots of cruciferous vegetables, lots of asparagus, lots of salads, and they could still be just getting their energy from meat. And so the answer is, I don't know at what level that's going to be healthy. I just know it only takes about 3 to 5 servings of salmon for me to have diabetes again. So I don't do it.
Yeah. Well, what you're pointing out here is the macronutrient, right?
The fact that it doesn't work. It doesn't work to segregate food that way.
Yeah. But you're kind of categorizing the foods based on the predominant macronutrient.
Well, it's more than that. I'm not doing it that way, and I'm doing it. I only put that there to say where did the energy come from. But other than that, we forget about it. No, it turns out that these foods segregate way more than macronutrients. They segregate amino acids. So, for example, branched chain amino acids, methionine, things that we know are positively associated with cancer. They segregate heme iron versus other sources of iron. They segregate phytonutrients. They segregate different vitamins, different fats, polyunsaturated fats versus saturated fat. It is so much more complicated. If you go to the macronutrient organization of food, you're going to fail because it doesn't have enough detail to make a decision. So calling something a protein, immediately you lose it because it doesn't really matter. It just forces you into chronic overnutrition.
I totally hear you. But what I'm trying to maybe like point out for, for you, it's obvious, but maybe for other people, like there's the micronutrients in the diet as well,
Mm-hmm.
which, when we're talking about longevity, when we're talking about healing, when we're talking about reversing disease and maintaining optimal health, it's really a matter of getting as many micronutrients into our diet per calorie, right? Like
Maybe
I've heard you
not.
talk about.
Maybe not.
Okay.
It may
Okay.
not. It may not be because we
Yeah.
didn't make those organisms live longer by giving them lots of extra micronutrients. That doesn't happen. Those studies don't exist.
Okay.
You need
That's a good point.
enough.
Yeah.
You need
Yeah.
enough. But you. Why is it that you were taught this way, and why is it that your framework is this way? And the reason I believe is because when food is economically scarce, every dollar counts. In other words, look, $100 is $100. It doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or poor. The value of $100 is the same. But when you only have enough money to barely meet your monthly budget, how you distribute each one of those $100 is very different than if you have a huge excess of money.
Mm-hmm.
And so one way to look at it is that the model that you learned in school and the model that's still taught primarily to dietitians and to physicians is what I would call the deficiency model. Food is economically scarce. Let's make sure we get as much as we can of these things because we don't want to be short on anything. We want to be able to pay every bill at the end of the month, every nutrition bill. But the other side of it is we've never extended life by overdoing it. And I'm suggesting that even some of the most poor diets out there are pretty rich in nutrition. Nobody's dying of nobody has scurvy, nobody has pellagra, nobody has rickets. These are diseases of nutritional deficiency. And what happened is that then ballooned into this overall, nutrition is good, phytonutrients are good, but there just isn't any basis to drinking big green smoothies so that you have all that. I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm saying that the reason why is likely the reason why, meaning the only mechanisms that we've come up with for longer life at the cellular level have to do with activating the longevity pathways. And those aren't.
I think we're talking about like longevity and then versus
I'm
healing.
talking about health span.
You're talking about health.
I am
You're
talking about health
span. And I'm kind of talking about like healing and reversing disease.
And all of that is the same.
Yeah.
It is the same. There is no difference. I know it sounds different to you, but we're actually saying the same thing. We're describing it with a different framework. Okay. It's not that your framework is wrong. It's just that framework of nutrition, of adequacy, doesn't explain all the results.
Well, just to kind of like push against this a little bit.
Absolutely.
I totally
That's the
hear
best
you.
part.
Yeah, but like just to push up against it a little bit, like for example, vitamin C. Vitamin C in the diet. I'm not talking about like vitamin C supplements, but vitamin C in the diet. The RDA is like set super low just so we don't get scurvy. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests that a lot of people don't have scurvy, but they might have chronically not optimal vitamin C levels, which is
all right. So can we change it to vitamin K for a second?
Sure.
Because I know I know the mechanism on K1 and K2, and I'll give you a great example. So really quick for everybody, we won't go into the technical side, but just say K1 and K2. Leafy greens are loaded with K1. And so one of the things that we talk about with K1 is the idea that if we take, if we eat lots of leafy greens, we get plenty of K1. Now the K vitamins are used in two primary things. One, they're used in the blood clotting proteins. They're used to synthesize the blood clotting proteins. But K vitamins are also very critical for mobilizing calcium from the vascular system to the bone. Is this familiar at this point?
Yeah.
So
for sure,
getting a lot of K vitamins is absolutely important. So getting a lot of K vitamins is important from a perspective of both clotting and osteoporosis, bone strength. Here's an interesting point though. K2 is utilized mostly out in the vascular system for the transport of calcium, but it isn't used for clotting. So what ends up happening is that when we eat a lot of leafy greens, you might have enough, but your body might dispose of that excess K1, that K vitamin. You may not have enough. And if you fall short, there's this really amazing papers by Bruce Ames on what's called the triage theory, that your body actually preferentially says, hey, clotting is a higher priority than migrating calcium at this point, and so that you're falling short. And this is an example what you're talking about, where extra might help out. And in the case of K vitamins, what it really actually means is you should supplement with K2 and not K1, and still eat your leafy greens, because both of those will probably work out. And so there's an example, where we actually know some of the mechanisms, where we know some of the specificity. There's probably a lot of anecdotal stuff out there with higher levels of lots of the other vitamins, but pretty much what we've seen across the board, and doesn't matter when it was vitamin E, vitamin C, vitamin D, the idea of more is going to help is not what we see in the health span, which that's the problem. What may be happening is it could mask something. So for example, kwashiorkors was believed to be a protein deficiency disease. Well, it turns out it wasn't. It turns out that when we look at discordant twins, that these are twins that one has kwashiorkors, one doesn't, and we give them protein, it masks the symptoms, but it doesn't cause it. It turns out their microbiome, a bacteria dysfunction, a dysbiosis in bacteria, which is what was really causing it. And that when we take each of the twins, when we take a sample of their microbiome from the intestinal tract and why is that word just slipping me? Transfer into a sterile mouse. One of the mice will get kwashiorkors, other one won't. And so all the extra, peanut, powder or peanut, food that they were giving third world countries where this was happening was masking the symptom, but it wasn't actually curing it. And so, but what we do know for sure is that if you get to a point in these where you get sufficient but not excess across the board from yeast to primates, so we're talking about a lot of biology, and where everybody says, well, this isn't the same and this isn't the same. That's the point. The point is it's a wide range of life, and they all metabolize glucose. This is one of the arguments I would say anybody who is glucophobic is kind of crazy. Sugar is not the end of the world. The kinds of foods we make with sugar, yes. But the idea that the glucose molecule is somehow causing all this problem is ridiculous, right? You and I both see this, right? It's just crazy to think the only molecule that's metabolized by every single solitary organism is the one that's
literally giving us life. It's literally,
exactly.
And any moment of the day, it is our lifeline.
Even if you don't eat glucose, when they use this as some of the other sides, even if you don't eat it, your body makes it. And they use that as say, oh yeah, you don't need it.
It's going to be 70 or 80 milligrams per deciliter in your blood, even if you starve yourself for a year.
55. I mean, my glucose was running around 55, 24 days into a water fast. I measured it with a glucose monitor the whole time. So yeah, the point is it's there. So getting back to your point, and I know this is your framework, but I want you to consider something a little bit different here, which is when the only tool in the toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And from our past intervention, one of the most major breakthroughs that we had after we understood the three components of energy, which happened in the mid-19th century, was understanding A, the amino acids and the role they ended up having in constructing proteins, and B, the vitamins that come out in the 20s, right? For over a century, not much has changed. If I pull Dubois' book off the shelf right there from 1932, it's pretty much the same as today. And the problem is we can prescribe these things. We can prescribe these compounds. You know, the limeys were able to get vitamin C on those long voyages, and it was very prescriptive, as you're saying. I think that we're right at the precipice of a very new kind of way, a new framework, where what you learned in school and what people are going to be learning 15 years from now is about to radically change. Because we've already extended the life of mice radically. We have reversed age in mice. That's crazy. We have accelerated aging in mice. Young ones are getting old. The exact same, from the exact same litter, by expressing certain genes or repressing certain genes. Mm-hmm. We are right at the level. There is no biological reason we can't live forever. And a hydra does.
Yeah.
A hydra does. It's a single little organism, kind of looks like Medusa.
I'm still digesting what you just said. There's no biologic reason that human
biological
beings can't
limit
live.
For our life. There's no reason. What
is like, you know, the heart, the brain, things fizzle out.
Everything that you have right now started out as a single cell. You have the blueprint for everything that you had. Now those blueprints get wound up really tight around the histones and packed away. If we could take your DNA and stretch one strand of DNA and stretch it out, it would be around 2 meters. If we could take all of the DNA in your body, every cell, and stretch it out end to end, it would be wider than our universe. That's wild. How long it is. Billions of miles, 9 totally billion miles, right? So here's the point. All of that gets packed up. The cells in your eyes and your retina, and the cells on the bottom of your big toe, all have the blueprints for every other cell in your whole body. But a different part of them is unpacked and packed back in. And what we're learning in longevity research is that packing and unpacking, we used to think that the DNA got scrambled and it was all disjointed and mutated, right? So we would accumulate those mutations over time. Turns out that that's not an accurate picture. This is where the free radical kinds of ideas, you're oxidating, you're mutating your DNA. It's not that can't happen. It's just that's not what appears to be happening in these other organisms, or probably us, which means it's more akin to coming in and cleaning up your desk. In other words, all this DNA, you're expressing, for lack of better ways to think about it, you're expressing a liver cell in your brain, and that's what ends up becoming a brain tumor, because your brain isn't supposed to have liver cells there. So it's this epigenetic modifications, which is the fancy word, which are reversible. These are by methylating and acetylating certain genes, you either cause them to pack up or unpack. And the sirtuin genes, which you read about in our paper, in both of those papers with David Sinclair's worked on, those sirtuin genes repack your DNA. So at a cellular level, you might be remodifiable at any age. That's not to say that you'll necessarily do the Benjamin Button. But what it also says is, look at the difference, like right now with you and I. I turned 55 on Friday. I don't feel 55. Most people don't guess me at 55 when they know me. Yeah. You know, I didn't look this way 15 years ago. I looked a lot older. And so what I'm saying is that it may be that during those times of dietary restriction without malnutrition, some of that metabolic house cleaning goes on. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
It's a crazy different framework. It's not, I want you to understand that, especially everybody listening, this is really that creative friction that happens where we take worldviews and they come together and something magical comes out of it. That's what's, when you ask me why I'm so excited about doing this for science sake, this is just really interesting stuff. We're at the precipice of being able to radically extend our lives. And I think that's amazing.
Well, Ray, I've got an appointment at the top of the hour. So I'd like to kind of wrap things up in the next 5 minutes here, and like
Fantastic.
I feel like, you know, we started this conversation. Well, before we hopped on the call, it's like, well, should we talk about? And I was like, oh, you know, just whatever. And now I'm realizing, holy cow, I should have known that we, you know, we could talk forever. But and if we live forever, then we can talk
Yeah,
forever.
we
That's
should.
the good thing.
But here, look, the summary, the take home of all of this is really
Yeah.
simple, and that is vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. You know, we're talking about soups, salads, sides, and sweets. And in our book, Healthspan Solution, that comes out in December, if you go to healthspansolution.com, you can be notified there, or it's on Amazon. We go through some of the things I just talked about with you. In fact, the first 4 chapters, there's no pantry tips. There's very little, you know, there's not how to water saute or any of that, but there's 100 delicious recipes that are made from those ingredients. And I think what's so exciting is that by just eating a little less often, you know, feel a little hunger a little bit, you know, compress your windows, eat once or twice a day. You don't have to eat all day long. Skip a meal here and there, it's fine. And then when you do eat, you know, don't jump into the fake meat things. Like, that's a rare and appropriate, right? You know, that's not something you need to have as a part of your daily diet. Don't worry about protein, carbs, and fat. Don't use those things. Just vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices, soups, salads, sides, and sweets. That's our message. And with all of that complicated stuff that we were discussing, what I can tell you is that when we actually work with our clients, we don't really get into all that. It's really not relevant. They get 24 recipes. And as you've seen in your practice, and I know you've seen this over and over, if people will just stick to it and not deviate, because the new habits that we talked about being equally convenient, familiar, enjoyable, moderation is the enemy of success for creating a new habit. You don't moderate yourself to a new habit. You got to be extreme. Go for it. You know, climb Everest, as Penn Jillette says in his thing. You know, you got to just go for it. And that's what I did with Dean Ornish's challenge. And it changed my life. It changed everything I'm doing in life. And I would have never, ever stumbled or researched my way into this. I actually had to experience it. And so that's how I would wrap it up. I would say, if you can just find those new favorite foods, all it takes is 5 to 7 recipes, and just rotate them for a while and stay focused. Don't do the restaurant food for a while. Don't do the birthday celebration. There's always an excuse to celebrate with food. Just chill for a little while. And I think the excitement why you're doing this, and I'm projecting some, but I think you're going to say yes, is that you have this incredible job where people that come to you actually get better. And I'd say most physicians out there don't have that experience. At best, they manage a condition. And you and I and Julieanna, we see it all the time with our clients. Am I right?
Right on, all the time.
So,
I mean, it's people are always amazed, like, oh my gosh, I reversed this. Oh my gosh, I lost this weight. Oh my gosh, this is no longer a symptom. I'm not amazed, because I trust the body's innate ability to heal itself when it's given the proper ingredients. And what I hear you saying is, and not too much more.
yeah, that's the crazy thing. And we couldn't have guessed this, but you know, when Clive McClay did these experiments in 1935 with rats, the fact of the matter is it disrupted the way we thought of the body. And it's just now hitting mainstream. And that's exciting. And it's a really great opportunity for people like you that have seen the traditional medical kind of approach, because this sort of explanation also encompasses Western or Eastern medicine too. Because it may just be not necessarily that the herbs were necessarily doing all these things. We now know the microbiome, those herbs definitely changed the microbiome, but they also were doing stuff to eat less, just eat less, you know, and less is more. And that's, you know, less is hard to sell. It's hard to sell cold. It's hard to sell no food. But it turns out maybe a little metabolic winter may be what we need.
Yeah, I'm just envisioning this, beautifully packaged like dose of a breath. You just open it up and breathe it in, and maybe there's some microbes in there that populate your gut.
Yeah.
Hey.
But this is what's so wonderful, and I think that it's a huge opportunity because if people aren't worried about all this biochemistry that you and I get excited about, we love this stuff because we've done it before. But if you and I, if they could find a way just to sort of, hey, I just eat vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices. I'm doing that. I'm not eating so often. I'm eating once or twice a day. I'm reasonably active. Remember, exercise isn't the opposite of sedentary. Active is. And being active means going for a walk with your dog or somebody you love, or getting on a bike with your kids. It doesn't mean that you have to put on something and compete and keep time, or just, standing while you're having a conversation at the office. It can be really, parking farther away. So we have 10 health span habits in this book that mimic all the things that you learned traditionally in school. It's just a different twist on it.
Yeah.
It's like,
well, Ray, I have a feeling that you're going to have to come back to talk about health
actually,
span.
Julieanna, maybe the next time Julieanna and I can both come on, because you've had Julieanna on before.
That'd be a lot of fun. I have, and she was great. And after I get my hands on health span, maybe we'll kind of dive into it together.
Fantastic.
And talk about it. Yeah.
And so, and join us on Science and Saucery, our podcast, and maybe someday the three of us can get on and chat about this.
That'd be a lot of fun. Ray, thank you so much for your extended time, your expertise, sharing your passion, your wisdom, and obviously Health Span Solution, mid-December, I think I saw, and Science and Saucery, the new
Science
podcast.
And Saucery. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. Peace and love. Take care. Until next time.